Hello, everyone. Welcome to the April 17th edition of Math 135. A reminder that you have WebAssign due on Friday. So today's lecture should be very short. We're just going to talk about doing hypothesis tests for proportions. That is, I'm polling, and I want to know, does this poll give me enough evidence to accept or reject some claim about the population? So this will be the analog of what we've done before with confidence intervals for proportion. We're going to do hypothesis tests for proportion now. So the process is very similar to what we've done. However, we have a couple conditions that we have to satisfy, just like we did for confidence intervals. So the conditions that we are going to satisfy are that p times n is bigger than 5 and 1 minus p times n is bigger than 5. The p is the p coming from the null hypothesis. So whatever the p is for the null hypothesis, that's what's going to be the p we use to verify a certain condition is true. All right, so let's take a look at the procedures, and I think it will make sense what we're going to do. So for a hypothesis test for proportion, we start off just like every other test. We state the null and alternate hypotheses and set our significance level of alpha. Here we have the test statistic. So that's this thing right here. Notice that's a z variable. That's the standard normal. The p hat is the sample proportion. And p is the proportion coming from the null hypothesis. And then we use the standard normal distribution, find the p-value, conclude the test, etc. So we're only going to do one example today because you're going to have two examples to do for your activity. So here is the poll we're going to do today. So if you read the news, there are very different views presented about the cause of global warming. So we're going to look at, well, what do Americans actually believe? So is there evidence that more than 60% of Americans believe that global warming is due mostly to humans? That's what we're going to find out. We are analyzing what do Americans think. So in March of last year, Gallup conducted a poll of 1,039 Americans, and 668 people in that poll reported they believed that global warming is caused by human activities. So we're going to do a hypothesis test where we test our null hypothesis for that 60% of Americans believe something versus the alternate hypothesis that more than 60% of Americans believe something based on this sample. So let's work this out. So let's write down what our null and alternate hypotheses are. The null hypothesis is that the proportion of adults who believe that global warming is mostly due to human activity is 60%, and our alternate hypothesis is that it's actually bigger than 60%. So now we need to calculate our test statistic. So first we need to find out, of our sample, what's the sample proportion of adults who believe that global warming is caused mainly by human activities. So there were 1,039 people who took the survey, and 668 reported that they believed that global warming was due mostly to humans. So that's p hat, that's our sample proportion. And we need to calculate our test statistic. Our test statistic is where we take this p hat, whatever this is equal to. And so if I calculate it, that's roughly equal to 0.6429. So we take our sample proportion, 0.6429. We subtract off the p coming from the null hypothesis, and we divide that by the square root of p times 1 minus p over the sample size, which was 1,039. And when you do that, you should get that the z-value is roughly equal to 2.824. So now we need to calculate the p-value. So remember that this is a right-tailed test. Okay, so here is our standard normal. Here is 2.824, and we want to know the right tail area. So let's use Excel to help us out. Remember, Excel will tell us the left tail area. So let's go to Excel. And what we type is equals norm.s.distribution of 2.824, comma true. And we get 9976. So we get for this area 9976. So the area on the right, which is our p-value, is 1 minus that. It should be 0.0024. All right. So, well, what do we see? We see that the p-value is less than alpha. I didn't say it earlier, but alpha was 0.05. This tells us that we reject the null hypothesis. The reason we make a conclusion from our test and don't just say reject or accept the null hypothesis is that people need to hear what this means in English and not just in the statistical speak. So what do we conclude? Well, we conclude at the 5% significance level that there is sufficient evidence to reject the claim that 60% of Americans believe climate change is due mostly to humans. In favor of the alternate hypothesis, that more than 60% of Americans believe that climate change is due mostly to humans. So we don't know how much more. That's not what we were trying to estimate. If you want to know how much more, you would create a confidence interval. But this hypothesis test has told us that we are very confident that more than 60% of Americans believe that climate change is due mostly to humans. You'll get some more practice with this in the activity in class. So let me know if you have questions.